Bravely Default 2 was a bitterly disappointing experience for me. It's a sequel that ignores a lot of what made the previous entries great, yet fails to compensate that with any unique improvements of its own that make up for it. I'm a huge fan of the Bravely series, in particular Bravely 2nd, which I believe improved on the original Default in almost every way, so going in I was really excited for Bravely Default 2, and I'm sure by the end of this video you'll understand just why I was so disappointed in that game. Bravely Default 2 was published by Square Enix in Japan, though Nintendo published the game in other territories such as North America and Europe. It was released exclusively on the Nintendo Switch, similarly to how previous entries in the series were released exclusively for the Nintendo 3DS, continuing the tradition of Nintendo platform exclusivity. Unlike previous entries in the series, which were developed by Silicon Studio, Bravely Default 2 was developed by Claytechworks, a development studio known for their large catalogue of titles such as Bravely Default 2 and pretty much nothing else. I mention this because it means that most of the development team from the previous Bravely games did not return for Bravely Default 2. One such notable omission is the lead character designer of Bravely Default 1 and Bravely 2nd, Akihiko Yoshida, who also worked as lead character designer on several other Square Enix IPs renowned for their character designs such as the Nier series, Final Fantasy XII, 14, Tactics and Vagrant Story. The reason I bring this up will become a lot more apparent later on in the review when I talk about the game's graphics and in particular the character and costume designs, and the way the designs translate into in-game models in a way that is noticeably different from the previous Bravely games and not in a good way. Another notable omission from the development team is the director of Bravely 1 and 2nd, Kensuke Nakahara, which could explain why a lot of the quality of life improvements that were made in Bravely 2nd are completely absent in Bravely Default 2. I'll go into more detail on what I mean by this when I talk about the gameplay of the game, because it factors greatly into my overall enjoyment of the game as well as my overall verdict. To be fair, it's not all unnerving news though, as the producers of Bravely Default and Bravely 2nd, Tomoya Asano and Masashi Takahashi, returned to produce Default 2, and Revo, the composer of Bravely Default 1, returns to compose the soundtrack for Bravely Default 2, which reassured me somewhat that Bravely Default 2 would at least feel like a Bravely game and not just a generic JRPG banking on the Bravely name to sell a few extra copies. Now, for the purposes of this review, I played through Bravely 2nd on Nintendo Switch on medium difficulty with a total runtime of around 70 hours, though I did not complete all of the side quests and I didn't really bother attempting any of the game's super bosses, as by the time I unlocked them I just wanted to get the game over with. So, I think I've prattled on long enough. Let's get on with the review and discover just why Bravely Default 2 was such a disappointment for me personally. Now, a good story is one of the more important parts of a Japanese role-playing game. When you've got a game that has an overall runtime of about 60 to 70 hours long, you've got to ensure that the narrative, characters and overall plot development is engaging enough to justify that length. Bravely Default 2, I'm sad to say, at least for me, has one of the weakest stories I've ever encountered in a JRPG. The main story thread is somehow more generic than the original Bravely Default, with the characters journeying across a surprisingly small world, collecting the 4 elemental crystals that keep the world in balance, whilst also evading the evil empire that wants to conquer the world, even though they're being manipulated by a higher power that wants to destroy the world. Overall, the story is very similar to that of Bravely Default 1, but somehow worse in every way, and I think it's mainly due to the fact that it's so similar, yet the minor differences in the plot, such as the major twists and turns, are somehow far more predictable and far less interesting than that in Default 1. Where the first Bravely Default took classic JRPG tropes such as Warriors of Light seeking crystals to fight an empire, and played around with them in order to subvert expectations, Bravely Default 2 just follows the tropes to the letter with no nuance or subversion to make the use of those tropes interesting or unique, and as such it just feels incredibly generic. The story pacing also feels very iterative of Default 1 as well, as the first half of the game focuses on the party's attempts to track down the crystals, with each chapter focusing on a specific crystal in a different part of the world, usually fighting against 3 or 4 Asterisk members, similar to how in Bravely Default 1 you visit a different continent in each chapter, restoring one of the 4 crystals whilst facing off against 3 to 4 Asterisk members. It all just feels a bit repetitive, formulaic and vapid, though I will admit that despite it all, Chapter 2 and 3 were probably the most enjoyable of the game's chapters due to how interesting the individual chapter storylines were, as well as how they developed some of the main characters during it. Speaking of which, now let's talk about the characters in Bravely Default 2, because even a mediocre to bad plot can be brought up a bit if the cast of characters is well developed and interesting. Sadly, as you'll quickly discover when you play this game, the characters match the quality of the story and are for the most part bland and uninteresting with poorly written motivations and characterizations, though there are some bright spots to be had just like with the main story. The main protagonist, Seth, for example, whom can be renamed at the start of the game, is the worst character in the game by far, in the sense that he has almost no character. Seth is an amnesiac sailor who becomes shipwrecked at the start of the game. His involvement with the central plot is that he's just kinda there, and the main form of characterization you get from him is that he sometimes reacts to the plot developments as they happen. The next party member, Gloria, is a princess of a former kingdom who is focused on reclaiming the 4 crystals to prevent the world from being destroyed. Her characterization comes in a completely opposite form to Seth's, in the sense that she actually has quite a lot of importance to the plot as a whole, and as such a lot of the cutscenes that define her character mainly consist of her spouting how she's too focused on the plot to develop her character, which admittedly makes her very bland and uninteresting as a person. Thankfully, there are a few small skit dialogues here and there that do give her a modicum of depth, but sadly not enough to make her an interesting character in my eyes. Thankfully, the other 2 party members, Elvis and Adele, are actually a lot better and are easily some of the best characters in the game. Elvis is a travelling magician who is searching the world for asterisks in order to decipher a mysterious book that his mentor left behind. A large part of his character development comes through his interactions with everyone, as well as through occasional flashbacks with him and his mentor. I think what makes him such a likeable character is that unlike Seth and Gloria, he actually has a really likeable personality that is easily conveyed through his dialogue, so it's not as difficult to get a sense of who he is and why he lives life the way he does. Adele, on the other hand, is also quite good, though not as initially likeable as Elvis is. Her role in the story is that she is a mercenary searching for a lost sister and was hired by Elvis to help him with his asterisk hunt. She, for the most part, takes the same role Adia did within the party in the original Bravely Default as the bold and brash party member whom loves to eat. Admittedly, none of the party members really outshine the party members from any of the previous games, and in fact in most cases, aside from maybe Elvis, feel very much like the Diet Cola or Decaf versions of the cast of the original Bravely Default, with Seth being a less interesting version of Tiz and Yu, Gloria being an even less interesting version of Agnes, and Adele being a decent yet overall inferior version of Adia. The friendships and relationships they form over the course of the game with each other likewise feel like underdeveloped versions of the ones formed in Bravely Default 1 as well, with Seth and Gloria forming a similar relationship to the one between Tiz and Agnes, as well as Elvis and Adele sharing a relationship similar to that of Ringabel and Adia. Though I say relationships with a grain of salt, as the romantic relationships and really the platonic friendships as well in Default 2 are only really explored in a handful of cutscenes and as a whole feel very paper thin. Now, I bet you're hoping that perhaps the antagonists of the game will make up for the fairly bland and uninteresting main cast, but aside from a few exceptions, they are actually somehow far worse. The central antagonist for a large part of the game, for instance, who is obviously not the real main villain because Bravely the series is inherently predictable in its narrative due to it drawing so much from its inspirations of the older Final Fantasy titles where the Empire is never really the main villain, is incredibly one-note and uninteresting. Adam is the leader of Holograd, the evil empire hell-bent on conquering all the other kingdoms in the world, using the crystals and asterisks to weaken them through subterfuge. Adam, however, only appears in a couple cutscenes, and his entire motivations and personality is that he is an evil dictator who wants to rule the world, with no real personality outside of that. The true main antagonist, who obviously I can't mention due to spoilers, but is incredibly obvious if you play past the first chapter or two, is just as bad, with a clear motivation towards their actions, but no real personality or interesting background to give that motivation any depth. It just feels like they're being evil for the sake of being evil instead of their actions being driven by some believable reason. The other side characters, such as the various asterisk wielders or town leaders, are all decent for the most part, though fairly uninteresting due to their involvement in the story only being brief, and most disappear after the chapters they appear in end. The two optional asterisk holders, for instance, only appear for a side quest or two before completely disappearing and never reappearing again, aside from as optional endgame super bosses. Bravely Default 2 has a plethora of side quests that unlock over the course of the game, which, in terms of quantity, definitely makes it the best Bravely game in regards to side content, as there's hundreds of the bloody things. However, as I've established in other reviews on this channel, quantity is not indicative of quality, and though Bravely Default 2 has the most side quests, most of them dissolve into nothing more than mindless fetch quests for borderline useless rewards. There are some side quests here and there that are rewarding, whether by providing a deeper insight into some of the game's many characters, or by unlocking one of the optional asterisks that can be found along the way. Though that being said, the optional asterisks are actually required to finish the game's story completely, so calling them optional is a bit of a stretch. The more interesting side quests are usually the ones with cutscenes that offer more depth to the game's narrative, or take you through optional dungeons, which again offers more content to do, though, as I'll get into when I talk about the game's dungeon design later in this video, often feels more like a curse than a blessing. It also felt like most of the game's character development was done in the side quests, so more of it being rearranged into the main story instead of being buried beneath heaps of mind-numbing fetch quests where that you could miss something may have been a better idea, as it would have helped the game's somewhat stilted pacing at the same time. Now, I know I've definitely been a bit pessimistic about the story and characters for the most part, but this is genuinely my feelings after playing through the game to completion. I know some of you might feel differently when you play it for yourself, but I personally found it to be a fairly vapid and boring experience. The story and characters for the most part just did nothing for me, and honestly, if it weren't for the fact that I enjoyed Bravely Default and Bravely Second, I probably would have dropped this game and not looked back. JRPGs in general tend to be some of the longest single-player experiences out there, with playtimes running anywhere between 50 to 100 hours to finish just the story, sometimes even longer, and as such require strong and memorable stories to keep people interested when sinking so much time into the games. And sadly, Bravely Default 2 just completely failed to keep me drawn in, to the point that by the time I finished Chapter 3 I had no interest in completing all the side quests that the game had on offer, instead just hardlining straight to the end of the game to get it out of the way. Though I did try to complete every quest that features cutscenes or some semblance of character development, as mentioned before, most of the character development is done in the side quests for some bizarre reason. It's the only time on this channel that I've reviewed a game that I didn't 100% complete, and I think in this case it definitely demonstrates just how much the game's narrative failed to click with me, which is saying something when you consider some of the games that I did manage to 100% complete despite complaints, such as Assassin's Creed Valhalla and Crash Bandicoot 4. So yeah, overall I found the story and characters in Bravely Default 2 to be quite underwhelming. I wouldn't say it's completely atrocious, as the story is mostly fine, albeit told kinda shoddily, with poor pacing, and it is absurdly generic. Some of the character moments are enjoyable. It's just if you're an avid fan of JRPGs, or even just Bravely Default and Bravely Second, you'll have seen it all before in far better games.
I've a few things to take care of myself.
Very well. Until then.
As always, whilst a game can live or die by the quality of its story, the quality of its gameplay is also just as important, and even a game with a forgettable story can be brought up to a more memorable level if the gameplay is captivating enough. So let's discuss the general gameplay of Bravely Default 2, because it's probably the aspect of the game I'm most conflicted with, as whilst it has some improvements compared to the gameplay of its predecessors, it also makes some changes that detract from the game substantially, including omitting various quality of life aspects from the other Bravely games that would have definitely made this game more enjoyable. Firstly, let's discuss the element of the game you'll be experiencing the most in Bravely Default 2, which is of course the turn-based combat, which for the most part operates the same as the combat in Bravely Default and Bravely Second, just with some notable changes that set it apart from the others for better or worse. The combat in Bravely Default 2 is turn-based combat, where you'll choose various actions during a party member's turn to combat against an enemy, who will likewise choose an action to perform when it's their turn. These actions can range between attacking, using abilities available to the jobs the current party member has active at the time, using an item, or using the game's unique Brave and Default systems. Before I go into detail with the Brave and Default systems, however, I need to explain that every character in a battle utilizes a currency called Brave Points during combat. How Brave Points work is that during combat you'll consume a Brave Point with every action you take, sometimes more than one if an ability requires it, and you'll gain a Brave Point at the start of every turn. When you use the default action, that party member will enter a defensive stance, receiving less damage and making them less susceptible to status effects, without expending a Brave Point. The Brave action, however, does the opposite and allows you to expend an extra Brave Point to perform another action in the same turn. These mechanics add an extra layer of strategy to the game's combat because a character will only be able to have a turn when they have a positive number of Brave Points, and since you can expend into the negatives when excessively using the Brave action, it adds an extra level of risk to every battle. Do you go wild and brave into the negatives in order to quickly deal with enemies, meaning it will take longer for your turn to arrive and leaving you open to multiple attacks in the meantime if you fail to take them all out? Or do you default and save up so that you can go wild with the braving later on without the risk? This mechanic isn't new to Bravely Default 2, as Bravely Default, Bravely Second and even Octopath Traveler all utilize it, and for the most part it works fine here, though it is definitely the weakest implemented out of all of them due in part to the way Bravely Default 2 decides turn order. Unlike most JRPGs where the turn order is decided sequentially, as in you have a turn, then the opponent does, and so on until one side is eliminated, Bravely Default 2 decides turn order based on each character's speed stats. This means that if your characters have a speed stat significantly higher than an enemy's, then your characters may have multiple turns before the enemy gets theirs. Now, this way of managing turn order isn't inherently bad, as some other games, like Final Fantasy X for instance, implement it quite well. But in Bravely Default 2, this method of managing turn order is an issue for many different reasons in my opinion. Firstly, none of the actions aside from the basic attack action really work with this turn order style, as a lot of the job abilities that add buffs or debuffs to a party member or enemy, aside from status effects, stay active for a set amount of turns, which means the amount of time they stay active is very difficult to predict, especially since, and this is the main issue here, there is no accurate way of keeping track of whose turn is when, unlike most other JRPGs. There's a small bar underneath each player character which somewhat tells you how close it is to their turn, and a small exclamation mark appears by an enemy when their turn is coming up, but there's no way to tell if that means the enemy's turn is next, or after another enemy who has the mark, or your own character's turns. It's especially confusing to figure out turn order manually when you factor in the Brave and Default mechanics, because the whole point of those mechanics is to manipulate turn order, but some enemies will have such a high speed stat that they'll get multiple turns before your characters do without expending BP anyway, which makes the whole mechanic feel fairly pointless and in some cases incredibly unfair. This is especially true when considering that there are no tutorials in the game to notify you that turn order is based on speed, so if you aren't keeping an eye on that specific stat when building your party up, or when deciding which jobs each character will have, then you'll be in for a really rough time, especially during the mid to late game when enemies have increasingly higher stats and more annoying movesets. To coincide with that, a lot of enemies, and in particular the bosses in the game, have a new mechanic called counters. The counter system is probably my least favourite addition to the game, as it means that unless you have specific job layouts in your party, some of the bosses will be borderline unbeatable. To explain what the counter system is in simple terms, it means that when an enemy is hit with a specific attack type, or when the party does a specific action, such as hitting an enemy with a physical attack or by healing the party, there is a chance that the enemy will be able to counter, either by dealing damage to the party or by gaining a free brave point. The problem with this is that most of the bosses in the game have multiple counter triggers, and most of them are tied to their weaknesses or incredibly generalized to the point that a lot of actions fall under that trigger. And to top it off, their counters usually deal just as much damage as a regular attack from them, meaning not only can some enemies have multiple turns dependent on their stats, but they can also essentially gain free attacks on you if you dare to try to actually deal damage to them. It's just a real pain in the ass, and not in a good way, especially since it's impossible to predict what a boss's stats, abilities and counter triggers will be going in, which makes it incredibly difficult to build a party to accurately combat them. Thankfully, one of the jobs you can unlock in the game, I think it's the Archer job, has an unlockable ability called Counter Savvy, which lets the character that has the ability equipped avoid any counters that attack them. This, however, isn't great because it forces you to level the class on each of the party members to ensure that they have the ability, which will take quite a bit of time to grind. On the topic of the job system, let's talk about that now and how that factors into general gameplay and combat. Over the course of the game, you will be able to unlock several different jobs, usually by defeating the boss with that job and taking their asterisk of it. Each party member can equip 2 jobs at a time, one as a main job, which you'll be able to gain job XP for, as well as use the class's specialty passive abilities and regular actions. The other class that can be equipped will be labelled as a sub-job, and with that you'll only be able to use the abilities at the level the job is currently at, and won't gain any XP for it during combat. Each party member will also be able to set 5 passive abilities each, in a separate menu. These passives can be from any of the jobs in the game, such as the aforementioned Counter Savvy ability from the Archer job, provided you have reached the level in that job on that character where the ability unlocks. There are a staggering amount of jobs and job abilities in the game, which on paper allows you a lot of choice when it comes to your party makeup, but you'll soon discover if you play the game yourself that it doesn't quite work out like that. For starters, if you want to actually have any amount of fun with the game, you'll want to level all of the characters up to the max level in the Freelancer job, which is the one you start off with, as soon as possible, as that job's last passive abilities that unlock boost job XP significantly and will take up 3 of the 5 individual character passive ability slots for most of the game once you've got them available to you, decreasing the amount of freedom you can have with the system until you reach the end game and no longer require those abilities. You can't not get those abilities for all the characters either, because each job needs to be leveled for each character separately, which can take quite a lot of grinding to do, and let me tell you, grinding is incredibly boring in this game because all enemies give a pittance of experience, whether character or job experience, so you really don't want to be doing any more grinding than you need to in order to progress. Now, you don't need to level every job for every character, but at the same time, you can't just stay as one single class for the entire game either, because you'll need a large range of jobs at a character's disposal because, as mentioned earlier, a lot of the bosses in the game can only really be beaten legitimately with specific job layouts, which again decreases the amount of freedom you're given in the game. On the topic of beating bosses legitimately, despite my complaints about how unfair a lot of the boss fights feel, there are still a plethora of ways to completely break them and abuse certain job mechanics more so than any other previous Bravely game. Though, admittedly, these are only really available to you through some of the last jobs you obtain over the course of the game. For example, one such technique that completely breaks combat in this game comes from leveling the Phantom job up to level 12, which unlocks the job's second specialty ability, which makes it so that any attack that afflicts a status effect always hits, provided the enemy isn't immune to it. This, combined with the Salve Maker's ability to combine items to inflict status effects, allows you to essentially stunlock every boss in the game with paralysis and poison, as every boss, including the final boss, is vulnerable to those effects. I'll admit, I started using this method myself when I got to the Adam boss fight 2/3 of the way through the game, as that boss fight was absolutely awful, as his asterisk is a variation on the Dark Knight from previous games, so when he gets to low health, his damage output is increased to the point that he can pretty much one-shot most of the party, and since enemies can use Brave and Default, I spent over an hour constantly wiping to him because he kept spamming all of his attacks at once, before I discovered the Phantom's technique, which I then used to stunlock Adam infinitely so he couldn't attack me at all. It could probably be considered cheating if it wasn't considered a legitimate method of progression in the game. Admittedly, there are more legitimate ways of dealing with bosses like Adam, but with a lot of the bosses in Bravely Default 2, it requires specific job layouts within your party, and if you don't have those jobs leveled, then you'll be forced to level them up to stand a chance against some of the more punishing bosses in the game, which will take hours of grinding, which, I will not lie, is really bloody boring and tedious. Grinding in the previous Bravely game, Bravely 2nd, was a lot more fun than it had any right to be because you could manually change the encounter rates, as well as the job XP gain rates without needing specific abilities or items equipped. As mentioned earlier in Bravely Default 2, your only equivalent option for that here is to equip the job point up abilities to maximize XP gain, but doing so only leaves you with 2 ability slots per character, and the overall experience gain rate isn't anywhere near as good as that in 2nd. It also doesn't help that the rate for regular experience is pretty bad across the board regardless, and the regular enemies in the game drop barely any experience, so it always feels like a slog. I think I've spent enough time talking about the game's combat for now though, since I still have quite a bit to talk about when it comes to the gameplay in Bravely Default 2, and I could probably talk about my issues with the game's combat for hours if I really wanted to. Put it simply, the combat in Bravely Default 2 is for the most part passable, though inferior to both Bravely Default 2nd and Octopath Traveler, which all use similar combat mechanics, though with better implementation. My main issues with the combat in Bravely Default 2 are the poor balancing when it comes to the jobs, as well as the boss movesets and the counter system. The turn order as well is very poorly implemented, with no accurate way of tracking whose turn is next and how quickly each character's turns take to recharge. Finally, the game is incredibly grind heavy, more so I think than any of the other Bravely games before it, due partly to the pittance of experience and job experience that are required when defeating regular enemies, but also because of the game's increased focus on forcing you to constantly level new jobs in order to be able to defeat bosses that are designed to only be effectively defeated by certain party makeups. In my opinion, experimentation and trying new jobs is part of the fun of the Bravely series. However, when the experience gain is so slow and leveling new jobs takes so long, that fun turns very quickly into a chore, especially when it feels more and more like you're being forced to experiment rather than on your own volition. So, next up, let's talk about the game's dungeons, as whilst you'll be spending some time in the game's towns and some time in the game's overworld, a large portion of your time with the game will be spent in the various dungeons that inhabit the world, of which there are many. I won't go too much into the overall visual design in this part of the review, as that's something I'll go into detail when mentioning the game's graphics and art style. Instead, here I will talk about the general layouts of the dungeons and how enjoyable they are. Firstly, the dungeons are all maze-like corridors that share the same overall gameplay throughout, which is a little disappointing. Some of the dungeons do have puzzles or terrain that inflicts status ailments such as poison that requires some strategy, but when I say some dungeons, I only really mean 2 or 3 in total, with most just consisting of corridors similar to how most of the dungeons in Bravely Default and 2nd operated. Treasure chests can be found hidden throughout each dungeon, encouraging players to explore the various different pathways the dungeons contain, and I will say that they do provide quite a bit of good loot, ranging from all sorts of equipment to the more useless items and ingredients. However, they ruin this by making a high percentage of the chests mimics for some reason, forcing you to fight a horde of enemies before being able to discover what is in the chest. This isn't fun to me because it detracts from the whole point of the treasure chests in the first place. The chests are placed in the dungeon to encourage players to explore instead of just following the quest marker to the end, and rewards their exploration with useful equipment and gear. Making most of the chests mimics only makes players less eager to explore and open the chests, which was the case with me because I ended up skipping most of the chests in a dungeon after a while because I was just tired of the tedium that exploration brought. It doesn't help that exploring the dungeons in general isn't fun to begin with, due in part to one critical flaw, and it's a flaw that the previous Bravely games didn't have, and that is the complete lack of any sort of minimap. In the previous Bravely games on the 3DS, every dungeon's map was displayed on the bottom screen so that you could explore the dungeons and navigate efficiently without getting lost in the visually similar corridors. However, in Bravely Default 2, this is completely omitted with no suitable alternative. There isn't even a minimap to help you navigate the nearby vicinity and identify how many enemy mobs are in the area, which is a real pain because sometimes the enemies blend into the environment quite well and can't be easily discerned until it's too late, and sometimes it's difficult to tell what's passable terrain and what isn't. Basically, exploring the dungeons is an absolute chore in Bravely Default 2. There is a marker that vaguely directs you in which direction you need to go to reach any quests you have active within it, but that's the full extent of the game's navigation systems, and even then, with how windy and maze-like the dungeons are, it can still be a real pain to reach those quest locations even with that navigation system. In terms of other gameplay systems the game has, the only other thing I really need to mention in this review is the arbitrary JRPG card game minigame that you'll find upon reaching the city of Savalon in Chapter 1. Here, hidden within a side quest chain, there is a storyline where you're introduced to B&D, a card game where you have to place cards on a grid to outmaneuver your opponents to end the game with more spots on the grid coloured in your colour, with the rewards for winning usually being points which you can then use to take cards from the opponent, as well as level your B&D rank. In terms of the game itself, it plays very much like a mix between Final Fantasy's Triple Triad and the board game Othello, in the sense that you'll place cards with specific attributes on the grid like in Triple Triad, but like in Othello, you'll overwrite the opponent's colours on the grid if you place a card that surrounds theirs. It's a surprisingly complex game, as each of the cards have unique attributes and special triggers that change how they work when combined with other cards, such as one that doesn't affect the grid in the slightest, but makes it so that any card that features a specific species of character have extra range with the grid it can cover. It's an enjoyable game for what it is, and it's one that I actually really enjoyed over the main game for the most part. You'll be able to face off against NPCs around the whole world, and there's quite an appeal to collecting the various cards in the game, though sadly there really isn't any reason to do it outside of fun and the short side quest that introduces you to the minigame, as after obtaining the Gambler asterisk from the quest giver, there are no other real rewards to investing any time into the minigame. Now let's move on to talking about the graphics and art style of Bravely Default 2, as well as the game's performance on the Switch hardware. Now, this is a difficult topic to discuss because reviewing a game's art style is very subjective and differs depending on the person giving the opinion. That being said, in my opinion, Bravely Default 2 is a very ugly game. Now, before I discuss what I hate about the game's art style and general graphical fidelity, let's talk about the few things I did like in the game. That being the design of the towns. The towns in Bravely Default 2 are all quite beautiful, with all of the buildings, interiors and the backgrounds utilising hand-drawn art. Admittedly, there are only a handful of towns across the entire game, but they are all very unique in their designs, from the sunny desert town of Savalon to the town overtaken by a giant tree, Wiswald. The designs of the towns in Bravely Default 2 are all quite unique and definitely its most memorable aspect. Sadly, those are the only real positive elements of the game's visual style and graphical fidelity that I can talk about, as everything else ranges from mediocre to downright awful. Firstly, the character designs, whilst good in concept art, look quite ugly and out of place due to how poorly they translate from concept to in-game model. I'm not entirely sure whether this is due to the lighting the game uses, or the faces on the characters being overly detailed compared to the rest of the character design, but I just do not like how any of the characters look in Default 2. The original Bravely Default and Bravely Second didn't have this issue, and I think it's partly because the concept art and general designs of the characters in those games were much easier to translate into appealing character models. It probably also doesn't help that the models in Bravely Default 2 are a lot more detailed than any other 3D assets in the game, which makes them look very out of place in the game's general overall art design. The enemy designs in Bravely Default 2 are alright for the most part, but man, Bravely Default 2 really does like to reuse them constantly throughout. Once you get a few dungeons in, you'll begin to realise that though the enemy designs are decent for the most part, with none that really stand out as amazing, a lot of the dungeons in the game decide to simply recolour enemies from previous dungeons and the overworld instead of creating more unique designs. The amount of enemies in the game that are just recolours of previous ones is quite staggering, with each enemy having easily at least 4 to 5 recoloured versions. Admittedly, this is a practice that a lot of other JRPGs adhere to, but it feels like this game goes way too far with it, as there are quite a lot of dungeons in the game that only feature recoloured enemies. A lot of the side quest bosses and non-story bosses are just slightly larger recolours of regular enemies too, or in the case of the endgame optional bosses, just reused buffed versions of bosses from the main game. The world of Bravely Default 2 is very lacking in terms of overall design, with each area consisting of a different biome, again almost iterative of those found in the world of the original Bravely Default, with each biome only really consisting of small smatterings of reused assets like low resolution foliage and rocks. Admittedly, there is more life to the world here than in the original Bravely games, as the enemies can be seen walking around, but in a way it somehow makes the world feel all the more emptier because they're the only things in the world that isn't static. So the general world design is pretty lackluster and generic, but how about the dungeons in the game, as they have the potential to allow for more opportunity for visual variety? Well, firstly, as I mentioned when talking about the gameplay, the overall layouts of all the dungeons in the game are fairly similar, with only a couple featuring any sort of puzzle or interesting mechanic to differentiate it in a gameplay sense. In a visual sense, however, thankfully most of the dungeons are quite unique, with each having their own theme and aesthetical design. There are admittedly some that are repeated or only slightly differ from other dungeons in the game, like most of the dungeons around Wiswald, but by and large there's overall a lot of variety to the dungeon designs, and whilst a lot fall under the same trappings as the regular world map, where the environments are bland and lacking in detail, there are also a lot that do look really nice and are well detailed. Basically, when it comes to the dungeons, it's a mixed bag, but none are really awful, at least in terms of general visual design. The cutscenes in the game are fairly basic as well. There are no pre-rendered cutscenes in the game at all, which honestly disappointed me a little because I really liked the pre-rendered cinematic openings Bravely Default 1 and 2 had. But it's not the end of the world, just one of the many indications that suggests that this game had a much lower budget than the others in the series. The other cutscenes mainly consist of either static scenes where characters face each other and talk, with maybe a couple repeated animations every now and then to make it feel at least a little alive, or very rarely cutscenes where the camera is a lot more free-flowing and the characters are more animated, allowing for scenes to have a lot more tension and the characters to evoke more emotion. The in-game party chat skits that can pop up every now and then are the weakest cutscenes in the game though, as they pretty much consist of profiles of the characters without a background or animation. None of the party chat dialogue is voiced either, which is a little disappointing as well. It's not all terrible though, as the game's UI does look quite nice in terms of its presentation. There are a few issues with the layout and organisation of the UI, as well as with the omission of some of the features from previous games. However, when it comes to its visual style, the UI in Bravely Default 2 works really well for what it is. So, from what I've established thus far, the general art style of Bravely Default 2 is a very hit and miss in terms of what works and what doesn't, and it often feels like there is a distinct lack of consistency when it comes to the various different assets and how they adhere to the art style. But what about the actual technical aspects of the game's graphics, and how has the series evolved considering the previous games were on the much less powerful Nintendo 3DS? Well, the answer is that graphically the game is somewhat of a mess, despite the better hardware. A lot of the texture work in the environment and assets is noticeably low resolution, to the point that at times, especially when using your Switch in dock mode on a TV, you can notice some of the individual pixels and textures. Just like with my review of Persona 5 Strikers last month, Bravely Default 2 has some shockingly bad anti-aliasing. In fact, I'd even say it's worse than Strikers because it was only really noticeable in that game on the character models, but here in Bravely Default 2, everything looks abnormally sharp and off, to the point that if you roam around the starting area, a lot of the world's assets just look like blurry, indistinguishable messes. The character models are the one aspect where the game's technical graphical style has noticeably improved, as the character models have significantly higher poly counts and better texture work than that of those in the 3DS games. However, as mentioned earlier, the new art style that they have gone with really doesn't work in my opinion, despite the higher poly count and potential for detail. So personally for me, I think the old 3D character models look a lot better, with more character and charm to them despite the lower overall graphical quality. It just goes to show that an art style is much more important than graphical fidelity. The game does have a decent general resolution, a lot better than the 3DS games did, that's for sure. However, the better resolution really doesn't amount to much of note considering most of the game looks graphically the same as the 3DS games did. All it does is make the subpar textures and low poly models look even more awkward. I should also note the general performance of the game is fairly hit and miss as well, as the game frequently freezes for a couple seconds when opening the menu or triggering cutscenes. The load times in the game aren't too great either, which is a shame considering how frequent they are. You'll often find yourself waiting for about 10 seconds every time you enter a new area, and a couple seconds every time you enter a new battle. And since a lot of the areas in Bravely Default 2 are fairly small and enemies are prevalent, you'll be seeing them quite constantly. The frame rate is fine for the most part, outside of the few freezes I mentioned though. Admittedly, outside of minor annoyances, a solid frame rate isn't vital for a game like this, though, as mentioned before, the brief freezes are a real pain. Overall, I'd say the game's performance isn't really great considering the poor graphical fidelity, and it very much feels unoptimized, especially considering that the Switch in handheld mode really does heat up and feel like it's struggling at times. Admittedly, it's not the worst looking game on the Switch either, and a lot of the issues that I had with the art style might be an issue for you. Either way, it's a little disappointing regardless because of how little the game's graphical fidelity appears to have improved from the previous games, which were on inferior hardware. As for the soundtrack of Bravely Default 2, as mentioned at the start of the review, Revo, the composer for the original Bravely Default's OST, returns to compose this entry in the series as well. A lot of the fans of the series were excited about this fact when it was announced, because some felt that the soundtrack to Bravely Second, which Revo didn't compose, was a step down from Default's. Personally, I like both Bravely Default and Bravely Second soundtracks equally. I think Second has the better quantity of enjoyable songs, but the enjoyable songs in Default were the better overall. In particular, I loved the character themes in the original Default, in particular Adia's theme and Ring a Bell's theme. Which brings us to Bravely Default 2's soundtrack, and honestly, it's still pretty great, with some awesome battle and boss themes. I personally think it's the weakest soundtrack in the series, as whilst it has great tracks, there are quite a few that are just slight remixes of tracks from Bravely Default, and a lot of the other tracks kind of blend together at times as well. The character themes are a step down from previous games as well, though they do match the characters' personalities quite well, for better or worse. I'll be kinda honest though, I'm just not a huge fan of the Bravely soundtracks in general, personally, as most of the tracks, in particular the battle tracks, feel way too busy for my preferences. Like, it's almost as if they hired an orchestra to play every instrument at the same time throughout the entire track at times. Not every track is like that, mind, and I do really like some of the tracks from all the soundtracks mentioned, but I just don't really get why some people consider the Bravely soundtracks to be mind-blowing legendary OSTs when a good portion of the tracks feel very middle of the road when it comes to memorable JRPG scores. That being said, for what it is, Bravely Default 2 does the job pretty well with its soundtrack, and you'll definitely be jamming your way through most fights in the game. Admittedly, it'll be difficult to shut your brain off and just vibe with the soundtrack when doing heavy amounts of grinding due to how bombastic and grandiose the battle themes can be, which for me personally is a negative point in its favour, but I'm sure some people won't mind. In regards to the game's voice acting, the game features dubs in both English and Japanese, with all main and side quest cutscenes fully voiced, though the party chat skits are not for whatever reason. In terms of the quality of the dubs, I can't really give an accurate opinion on the Japanese dub as I mainly played through the game with the English dub, but from what I've gathered it's pretty good and all the voices suit the characters quite well. The English dub, however, is the more interesting of the game's dub choices as, for whatever reason, they decided that every character in the game would have a different accent to their voice, ranging from Scottish to Australian and Russian to French.
It's alright, you know. You can tell us what you really think. Besides, if you're nice to this one, it'll only go to his head.
And what would be so wrong with that, eh? Go on, son. Praise away. I could do with a wee boost to the old self-esteem.
It's very over the top and can be quite annoying in some cases, and I have to wonder if perhaps they did this because they knew the characters were mostly bare bones in terms of their personalities and goals and required a strong accent to make them even somewhat memorable. That's pure speculation on my part, but it would definitely explain why they went completely wild with the accents in the English dub. It's not a bad dub for the most part though, and for what it's worth, most of the main cast have good voice acting throughout, and at the end of the day that's the important thing. I would definitely say that if you ever decided to play the game for yourself, try both of the dubs in the game, the English and Japanese, for a while to see which one you would prefer, as they're both completely different and completely change how the characters are perceived in the game tremendously. I've critiqued a lot of Bravely Default 2 over the course of this video, and I think it's plain to see that I just really didn't enjoy my experience with the game. The story was one I found very uninspired, generic, and just plain uninteresting, with few moments that stood out or evoked any form of emotional response aside from apathy. The gameplay I found mostly decent, but overall inferior to the previous Bravely games. The change to the turn system during combat just doesn't work well with the Brave default system, especially with the lack of any clear turn order indicator to help figure out whether one of your party members or an enemy is up next. The job system also feels a lot more unbalanced than in previous entries, with many more ways to completely break the game, while still somehow managing to make quite a few of the jobs pretty much useless. The game doesn't really look good on the Nintendo Switch either, and feels like it doesn't have a consistent art style. The character models, the towns and the world and dungeons all feel like they were taken from completely different games, and because of that, as well as the fairly poor graphical fidelity in general over the board, it was really difficult to truly appreciate the positive aspects of the game's visual design. The soundtrack to the game as well as the voice acting were pretty good across the board though, and probably the most enjoyable aspects of the game as a result. Sure, not every voice performance was amazing, and a lot of the music tracks did blend together and feel repetitive as a result, but overall when it comes to the sound of Bravely Default 2, it's mostly quite superb. So from all my criticisms, the question has to be asked, is Bravely Default 2 a bad game? And surprisingly, despite all my complaints, I'd say no, it's not a bad game. Don't get me wrong, I don't think it's a good game either, but it functions and the mechanics in the game all work for the most part. I think Bravely Default 2 is one of the least interesting storylines out of any JRPG I've ever played, and I really struggled to get through this game near the latter portions of it because I lost any enthusiasm I had for continuing on. It's a game that, despite being functional, feels soulless, uninspired, and fairly generic, lacking the heart that made the previous entries so memorable. I know a lot of my complaints too are a matter of opinion with which you may agree or disagree, but I truly think that Bravely Default 2 is a major step down from the other entries in the series. It also feels like an unfinished game, as the second half of the game's narrative passes by really quickly with very little explanation to any of the major plot points or events occurring. If you're a fan of JRPGs, and in particular the Bravely series in general, I'd say wait for a sale before purchasing it, or perhaps try the demo available on the eShop to see if it's something you think you'd enjoy. If you're not the biggest fans of JRPGs, however, I'd definitely say skip it because there are so many games like it that just do everything better and with more heart. It's a real shame because I was really excited for Bravely Default 2 as I really enjoyed the other games in the series and I was hoping that this entry would be the same. Still, I truly hope that if they do decide to make another Bravely game in the future, that they will learn from the mistakes made with Bravely Default 2 and create something a lot more inspired and a lot more interesting. Though I suppose we'll just have to see if and when that time comes. Thank you for watching this review. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit the like and subscribe button to show your support, as well as to prevent missing out on any further videos. If you have any thoughts on this video or on Bravely Default 2 itself, feel free to comment below with your thoughts and feelings. I'm curious to know what you all think. This has been Kingdom H, and thanks again for watching this review of Bravely Default 2. I'll see you next time